Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our study of Romans. That is our Sunday morning adult Bible class that we are live streaming today on Thursday for the Woodlands Church of Christ. Thank you so much for joining us. We are getting ready to complete a major section, in the book of Romans, and trying to put together this wonderful argument that the apostle has created for every generation by the power of inspiration in the Spirit to help us understand this grand and glorious theme in the book. Notice that at the beginning of the book, Romans chapter 1, in verse 16, he says, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to the Jew first and also to the Greek, for everyone who believes." Then he says in verse 17, explaining what I think is really the theme of the book, "For in it," the gospel that is, "the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, for the righteous man will live by faith." As I've noted all throughout our study of Romans, that for Paul, this book is about making God the righteous God, demonstrating that the purpose that he accomplished in Messiah was the purpose that he's always had, and that the Jewish nation and anyone who wasn't Jewish had no right to argue with God and say, hey, this isn't the way it's supposed to go, that God is the one who devised and delivered this plan of salvation in Christ, and it would be for faith, forever to faith, that this is how God would make people righteous. And when we come to chapter 9, after he's developed well the argument of why men are made righteous before God by faith, then in chapter 9 he begins to answer the question of, well, then what about Israel? What was God's purpose? How did Israel fit into the big scheme of things? And notice in chapter 9 in verse 6, "It is not as though the word of God has failed, for they are not all Israel who are descended from Israel," is the development of this last section. We talked about in chapter 10, last time that we studied, that he demonstrates his desire, which is in chapter 10, that all Israel would be saved. That is his desire, my heart's desire and my prayer to God. But he says they've not set out to follow the way of righteousness of God, but rather they've sought out to make themselves righteous before God in their own way. That is, through their position, through their choice to be the nation of Israel. That was all for their purposes that God's righteousness was about. And what Paul's point is no, it's about the glorification of God. It's about making God's purposes self-evident and making God's purposes the reason for which everyone glorifies. And that is to bring all Israel under Messiah. The question is, what does that mean? And that's what chapter 11 finally elaborates. Now I want you to notice in verse 1, I'm going to read the whole text, but some things I want you to notice before we begin the reading. Number 1, he breaks up or creates like he does all throughout the letter, he asks questions to break up thought. So that first question happens in verse 1. Has God rejected his people? In verse 7, what then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. And so the what thens, and then he asks in verse 11, did they stumble in order that they might fall? All of these questions are breaker points, or not subject changes, but key elements that help us distinguish what's happening as we read. Number 2, I want you to notice that chapters 9 through 11 answer the question generally of what was it that God was accomplishing through Israel. For me, I think a lot of times I've read this with the thought that Paul was talking to Israel, his physical brothers. And I've come to realize that that's not who he's talking to. He's talking to the church at Rome, who was likely and predominantly a Gentile church. There would have been an influx of Jews coming back into the nation, coming back into the city after the death of the emperor who had expelled them from the city of Rome. And the issue of the relationship of Jew to Gentile becomes a critical understanding of why the book of Romans was written in the first place. In fact, when you get to chapter 14, the subject of how fellowship maintains between Jew and Gentiles with different belief. Those issues weren't just one isolated aspect of the book, but rather probably draws our attention to the reality of why the book was written. The influx of Jews back into the city made Gentiles think, hey, wait a second, why are you coming back? We are the people of God and not you. Or some kind of arrogant declaration like that on the part of the Gentiles. So when you go back and you look at 9 through 11, I want you to notice that it's us and them, that Paul is talking about us, the true Israel, and them, physical Israel. In fact, probably the only time the word you in the first person is used to describe potentially a Jewish person, believer and unbeliever, that's only in chapter 9. And that one particular occasion occurs in chapter 9, verse 19. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? The you there could reference specifically a Jewish unbeliever. But if you go back and you look, especially here in chapter 11, the people that he's talking to are clearly Gentiles and Gentile Romans who are Christians. And so as you go through that, that's going to kind of, at least for me, it brought a great deal of light upon trying to understand this book. And also Paul culminates the whole story with an illustration that we're going to try to slide in PowerPoint pictures in here and talk through that as we go. So remember that. And last, he introduces, or not introduces, he fully explains the concept of remnant. And that comes into play in our illustration that Paul has drawn for us of the olive tree. So let's read the whole chapter. Verse 1. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scripture says of Elijah? How he appeals to God against Israel. Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect attained it, but the rest were hardened. As it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor. eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them, and let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. I'm going to stop there. I said I was going to read through the whole chapter, but I think I'm going to break it up in sections. I think that probably will be easiest. So verse 1, he asks, has God rejected his people? And clearly throughout the entire book, Paul's point is no. Israel has continued to receive and will continue to receive blessing from God as long as they continue in what God expected of them. And that is, when he presents something for them to believe, they are to believe it. So when Messiah comes and they don't believe, in fact, he'll go on and say in verse 11 that they stumbled, verse 11 and 12 that they trespassed, verse 12 that they failed, that in verse 16 they rejected. Those truths are true of the nation, the physical nation, completely. But there were individuals in that nation who, like him, said, I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham and of the tribe of Benjamin. God hasn't rejected me. Because, don't you know? And so he goes back and uses the illustration of Elijah, an unusual but yet convincing point that during Elijah's day, it was well known that in the nation of Israel, idolatry was rampant. And because of that moment in history, Elijah felt all alone. Like, who am I? I mean, I'm just all by myself here, Lord. And the Lord answers him and says, no, there are 7,000 who have not bowed their knee. So his point is, look even in Israel's old history, that within the nation, there still was a remnant. Within the nation of unbelief, there was still a believing remnant. A remnant that was following God and not turning to the idolatry of the day. And so notice, the knee bowers were part of physical Israel. But the knee bowers who were not, or the not knee bowers, those who did not yield to the idolatry, they were the obedient ones, and they were the remnant. And that's who he calls a remnant chosen by grace. Not just that generation, but any generation that as the remnant acts in obedience to God, even though around them there is unbelief. So when God replies, God teaches, Paul says, this teaching of remnant. And at the present time, he says, there is this same remnant, a remnant chosen by grace. That expression, chosen by grace, is of course Calvinistic. Not Calvinistic, but it's used by Calvinists to emphasize the teaching of Calvinism. Let me just say that I think in previous lessons we've well established the falsehood of the broad teaching of Calvinism. And that the idea of this choosing has not to do with personal salvation, but with the election of how God chose to accomplish his purpose. And so here, this choosing by grace is the choosing of a remnant. The way God has always worked things is that he knew not all of Israel, the physical Israel, would follow him. But he knew there would always be a remnant who would. And that election, that choosing by grace, is the way the election occurs, by the remnant choosing to follow and obey him. Then he says, but if it is by grace, that is the way God intended it to be, then it's no longer going to be on the basis of works, the way Israel intended it to be. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. Otherwise, it would not be God's purpose. It would be Israel's purpose. So what then? Israel has failed to obtain righteousness that it was seeking. But the elect, the remnant, obtained it. But the rest, the people who were in physical Israel, were hardened, just as it is written. And he quotes, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, Their table would become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. The very things that God would put before them would be the very things that they would stumble over, like the stumbling stone that he mentioned in the previous chapters, that the Israelites would stumble over the stumbling stone. Notice that in chapter 9. Let me get back there to it. Verse 30, he says, what shall we say? That Gentiles did not pursue righteousness have attained it. And then he'll say at the end of verse 32, that Israel has stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. That the way God had already planned his purpose, that when Messiah would come, Messiah would be a stone of stumbling, so that physical Israel would manifest their unbelief, and the gospel would go to the Gentiles. And in the Gentiles' reception of the gospel, the physical nation of Israel would grow jealous and potentially come back. Paul's point is this has been God's purpose from the beginning. That the election by grace was that God would offer the gospel to anyone who would take it, or God would offer his blessing to anyone who would accept it. And oftentimes those who would accept it would make jealous those who had not, and perhaps brought them to their knees in humility and made them come back. So I ask, he says in verse 11, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more would their full inclusion mean? So he sums up as he gets to the last application. Did Israel's stumbling happen so that they could never ever be God's people to their fall? And his point is no. And of course he's already established that I belong to Israel. I'm an Israelite, and I'm from the tribe of Benjamin, and here I am with God, serving God through the Messiah. But rather, he says, their stumble was so that the trespass of their stumble and the failure of their stumble, those are the two words he uses in this little small paragraph, is that salvation would come to Gentiles, that riches for the world would come. And the point is they stumbled so that the Gentiles could have these blessings. But if the Gentiles could have these blessings who were wild, how much more could they come back and belong to Israel again? That is, the true Israel, the Israel who serves with Messiah. So he says, going on in verse 13, now I speak to you, Gentiles. Now I want you to notice that he's talked about how God brought this to Israel, how Israel rejected, how the Gentiles benefacted, is that a word? Were benefited from their rejection, and consequently, at the same time, God hoped that the Gentiles coming in and receiving the blessings of Messiah would make the Jews jealous enough to come back and listen to the Messiah and believe. So he says to the Gentiles, and that awakens in my mind what we said at the beginning of this class, or this session, is that there must have been something going on in the church congregation of Rome that prompted Paul to draw this final, complete picture. I'm not suggesting that everything that anyone would write in the New Testament had to have some kind of historical narrative to set the stage to make us understand what he's saying. But I want you to notice that what he says to the Gentiles is basically this. Number one, you can't be arrogant. Notice he says that in verse 18 and verse 25. The first time he says it, verse 18, Do not be arrogant toward the branches. And then he says again in verse 25, lest you be wise in your own sight. I don't want you to be unaware of this. So perhaps there was this Gentile arrogance saying, okay, y'all guys blew it, Jews, and God doesn't want you anymore. We're the real deal now. And can't imagine people saying that, but I've heard many things similar to that in different kind of contexts, that nothing to do with Jew and Gentile per se, but still that arrogance rears itself in a lot of different contexts. I remember in a class that I had with a brother in Christ named Robert Turner, he called the Gentiles wild country cousins. And from the illustration that we're going to use in just a moment about the olive tree. And and then I came across in another commentary, a recent one by N.T. Wright, that says, Paul's saying to the Gentiles, you are not the new aristocracy. You are the wild country cousins. So I don't know if they were reading from the same books or where those two words came, how they all both said the same expressions, but that is Paul's point. Gentiles, you're the country cousins who are now participating in this great and glorious purpose that God made. The Gentiles are blessed by God, but that doesn't mean God isn't going to bless the Jew. And so that's the first point we should see. Not only does he remind them and speak sternly to them that they can't be arrogant, but he's going to go on and say, and you have to maintain your faithfulness. Okay, and I want you to notice that as we read this section. So beginning now in verse 13. Now I'm speaking to you Gentiles, inasmuch then as I am the apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, in order that somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead, that is, for them? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. An unusual little illustration there, that probably coming from his Jewish background, the idea of the first fruits. Read back in Numbers chapter 15 and verse 20, that when the first bit of dough was offered, that the rest of by that blessing of the first, the rest of it would be blessed. And I think Paul's point is, just like he says, if the root is holy, so are the branches. I don't think he means holy in the sense of saved, but sanctified. That is, if the first fruits that came from Israel is holy, that is sanctified or put to God's purpose, so really was the whole nation. And so if the branches are holy, it is only because they're holy because of the root, is his point. And I think that illustrates what he's going, or that's a statement that matches with the illustration that's going to come. That the remnant of Israel, those who, like Paul, accepted Messiah and did not bow the knee to Baal, but rather bowed the knee to Jesus, that remnant showed that God had intended the whole nation to be sanctified, that the first dough made the whole batch God's purpose. In other words, they're not to be cast aside. They're not intended to be thrown out. They're still part of that original dough that was sanctified. Then going on to verse 17. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, speaking of Israel, but God's kindness towards you, speaking to Gentiles, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, speaking of Israel, if they do not continue in their unbelief, they will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted contrary to nature into the cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel, until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will banish ungodliness from Jacob, and this will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Parenthesis. Jesus came to offer salvation to the world. And in that offer, part of Israel was hardened. And as they were hardened, the Gentiles were welcomed. And as the Gentiles were welcomed, Israel's hardening continued, but yet some of them, in their jealousy to be right with God, came home. Case in point, Paul. So in verse 28 going on, as regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake, those unbelieving Jews. But as regards election, those unbelieving Jews, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers, because they were called to the purpose of following Messiah. For the gifts and the calling of God are revocable. Not talking about their ultimate destiny. It's not talking about their personal salvation. It's talking about the gifts and the calling of Messiah to the nation. Verse 30. For just as you, Gentiles, were at one time disobedient to God, but now have received mercy because of their disobedience, so they, the Israelites, the Jewish nation, too have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may now receive mercy. For God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on everyone. I'm going to show you some PowerPoints and kind of talk through them. So we come olive tree illustration of Romans chapter 11. Notice in the picture, the cultivated olive tree in verse 24 is clearly a reference to the Israelite nation. He so calls it that in verse 26. When you compare it with other prophetic or prophet usages like Jeremiah chapter 11, and they're also in Hosea chapter 14, you see that that was an image that Israel was accustomed to viewing, because certainly the olive tree was common, a common tree in the nation. Also notice that in verse 17 he speaks of the wild olive tree that he says were clearly the Gentiles in verse 13 and verse 17. So his whole point is, as it begins in this illustration, is that there is a nourishing root, verse 17 and verse 18. That root, I believe, is Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, especially because of chapter 15 in verse 12. Now, there are some who view that the root system is the patriarchs and the promises made to the patriarchs. Some have said that it's God generally versus Christ specifically, because for I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed. And so I'm not going to just be completely dismissive of those other two possibilities, but yet to me the whole point is that the basis of the cutting off that he's about to begin illustrating was not that they were cut off because they rejected the promises that the prophets received, that the patriarchs received. It's not specifically that they rejected God himself, even though that's ultimately what they did. but specifically they rejected Jesus as Messiah. And so that's why, to me, that the root that supports this tree is the Messiah. That the prophets told the patriarchs, this is what's going to happen, and that God made possible, but rather it is the tree, it is the root of Jesse, Christ himself, that's holding the tree all together. For what it's worth. Then the wild olive branch is grafted into the tree. It's important to notice that when Paul makes that point that they're grafted in, they are grafted in because of their personal belief. That each of these branches ultimately represent an individual, not a nation. So the illustration is they're grafted in because of belief. That's important, especially in the context of our rejection of Calvinism. That in Calvinistic thinking, people become part of this tree because God chose them to be. But that runs counter to everything Paul is saying here in Romans chapter 11, that the Gentile was grafted in, not as a nation or not as a whole body, but as an individual. And they're grafted in because of belief. It's important that we notice that. Otherwise, the next picture makes no sense. Because he tells the wild olive branch that the only way they're going to stay in this tree is if they retain their faith. In fact, he says in verse 20, it's true that branches were broken off so that you could be grafted in. But they were broken off because of their unbelief, but you will stand fast through your faith. So don't become proud, but be afraid, for if God did not spare natural branches for their unbelief, neither will he spare you. Verse 23. If you continue in your faith, there can be no misunderstanding that the Gentile could only stay in this tree if they continued to have faith in Messiah. Then we come to the last point, that the natural olive branch, I see that I'm missing one of my points. Oh well. I'm sorry. And I don't have time to insert it now while I'm recording. So, I'm sorry about this. But the natural olive branch, he says, was cut off because of their unbelief. And just like the wild olive branch would be removed from the tree, the natural olive branch was already cut off because they had rejected Messiah. And his whole point is, which is the one slide that I wish I had converted here so you could see it, is that the natural olive branch in verse 23 can be grafted back in. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. So just imagine on the other side of this tree, I had a beautiful little picture of a natural olive branch in red, covered with the blood of Christ, grafted back in because that branch would accept Messiah as their salvation. Now, I hope that makes sense. This powerful picture of the tree is exactly a powerful, convincing conclusion to this whole story. That God has intended from the beginning to bring Messiah and unite Israel under Messiah. But the Israel that God envisioned was not a national Israel, but an Israel of all nations who would accept Jesus as Messiah. So Jews, they were still being given every blessing if they would accept Messiah. And Gentiles would receive every blessing accomplished in the Christ if they would accept Messiah and be grafted into this olive tree. So I'm hoping that that picture makes grand and glorious sense to you. It's a powerful picture, really using an audio. Anyway, he's telling the story, painting a picture like we do with PowerPoint, except when the preacher, like me, forgets the most convincing PowerPoint slide to transfer. So listen to how he concludes this story. The doxology that wraps up the whole story. Oh, the depth and the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? And who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him that he should be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. A powerful doxology to show Jew and Gentile, but particularly the Gentile, to whom Paul was writing this letter, that God intended to include them in this cultivated olive tree, and that they were no more special than the Jewish nation that God intended to graft into the cultivated olive tree. But the only way they both could be cultivated is through faith, their belief in Messiah. And that Paul's last doxology says, who would have ever drawn a picture like that? Who would have ever made people the same and given them all the same blessings on the same conditions of faith? Oh, how amazing. How deep is his wealth? How deep is his wisdom? How deep is his knowledge? That God, this grand and glorious plan of God, the gospel, because in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. For the just shall live by faith. So we will continue next week in Romans chapter 12. Take a good look and read of that in advance. And we're going to cover that next week. And chime in back here on Thursday at 10:30. Hope you have a good day. Stay well. And we'll talk to you soon.